The fight over bank deposits and stablecoin yield to me is really just the tip of the iceberg. We, I think, are undergoing a major paradigm shift where consumer expectations are changing. If you think about the fundamental value proposition of blockchain, it's that you replace intermediaries with infrastructure, allowing people to have more control over their own money. And the natural extension of that is you also allow people to capture more of the value of their own money.
Joining us now is General Counsel of Veda Labs and former SEC Senior Lawyer TuongVy. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course, thanks for being here. You heard the conversation we just had. You heard Renato and I at the top of the show. Are you optimistic that we will get this legislation passed before midterms?
I am. I think over the next few weeks, we can absolutely get there. I do think it is important to get something done. Crypto is a multi-trillion-dollar industry, and the simple fact of the matter is that it cannot meaningfully grow and flourish in a way that is responsible and protects both innovation and consumers without clear rules of the road. So we need a bill. And like with any bill, both sides have to be willing to compromise. And I agree with Kara, there's room to get there over the next few weeks or month or so.
What issue to you or issues do you think are the biggest hurdles right now to getting across the finish line?
Yeah, so I'll touch on one thing that you guys just discussed with Kara, which is the ambiguity over the SEC's exemptive authority. I do think the draft largely preserves the SEC's authority to create tailored rules for crypto, but I share the concerns about certain language, specifically Section 505(e)(2), that could impose a technology-specific constraint tied to how crypto assets can be issued, transferred, and recorded on a blockchain. And in practice, I think that probably will make it harder for the SEC to use its exemptive authority the way it historically has, right? That it'll create real litigation risk. I don't think it's fatal, but it's the sort of thing that I think does create unnecessary ambiguity and should be cleaned up in a markup. And then, of course, everyone's been talking about the stablecoin yield or rewards issue. And I did want to point out one thing, which is that I think with respect to this issue, I think we're sort of missing the forest for the trees here. The fight over bank deposits and stablecoin yield to me is really just the tip of the iceberg. We, I think, are undergoing a major paradigm shift where consumer expectations are changing. And I think that any sort of market structure bill that passes, which is something that, is going to be around potentially for generations, right? Any sort of bill has to sort of be future-proofed for that and recognize that, right? Because if you think about the fundamental value proposition of blockchain, it's that you replace intermediaries with infrastructure, allowing people to have more control over their own money. And the natural extension of that is you also allow people to capture more of the value of their own money, right? That said, I think the argument that the banks make is serious, that the system of credit we have in this country would collapse if bank deposits flee, right? But I agree with Kara that the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow that premise or that concern, right? Because we've seen this pattern before. It was the same argument that was made with the growth of things like money market funds and securitization and forms of non-bank lending, none of which led to the collapse of credit, right? It just reorganized the way that credit worked in this country. So I think we're seeing the same thing play out here. New financial infrastructure is not going to destroy our system of credit. It's just potentially going to reallocate it. And so I think that's sort of like the broader picture that we have to keep in mind with respect to this one issue that might seem a lot narrower.
Renato, I want to bring our audience comments in here too, folks commenting about privacy. And I just want to level set here. Is privacy mentioned in the draft at all? Is privacy even something that's being discussed?
I don't think it's been a focus of Congress. I mean, there are a bunch of crypto companies and projects and developers that have been working on things like zero knowledge or ZK cryptography for years. And so I think, we are going to start hearing a lot more about that because privacy is going to be a really essential part of this industry's ability to scale and just the ability of everyday users and institutions to meaningfully engage with the blockchain. But I don't think historically it has been a focus, although I think you will see more on this issue in the coming months and years.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think as institutions come in to the ecosystem, privacy is going to be really important for them as well. But Renato, I think I cut you off.
No, not at all. You heard our discussion with Kara a moment ago, and she thought that expansion of the CFTC's authority, particularly over spot markets, was very important. And it appears to me that these two bills in banking, or the two drafts in banking and agriculture, very meaningfully expand the CFTC's authority. I'm wondering if you read things the same way and what you think the balance should be between jurisdiction of the CFTC and SEC over this space.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way it's very straightforward, right? The SEC has jurisdiction over securities like it always has, and that is not going to change with respect to securities that are issued and traded on the blockchain. And so the key there will be making sure that we clearly define which digital assets are securities and which digital assets are something else, right? So that could be commodities that, digital asset commodities that fall under the jurisdiction of the CFTC. It could be things like meme coins or payment stable coins, right? Like there need to be clear lines between which regulators have jurisdiction over which kinds of assets and how that's defined. That said, I do think you could potentially see more overlap or collaboration between the two agencies, where, for example, the SEC could be given authority to oversee platforms that may be able to offer more than just digital asset securities. So that's one of the things that I'm watching sort of closely.
We were just talking a little bit about the issue that the banking lobby has with the stablecoin rewards or yield. And I know that you wrote an op-ed for CoinDesk that's going to be published very soon. How do you think that this gets resolved? It sounds like you're saying this is a regular discourse that we're having as we change the financial infrastructure. But how do you think it gets resolved? What do you expect to see next?
I mean, I hope that the different stakeholders here can reach some sort of compromise. I mean, I sort of look at it from like a higher level, or like I try to look at the big picture and think of it in terms of systems, right? So, I'm very skeptical of the argument that allowing consumers to earn more of the value of their own money is going to lead to a collapse of the system of credit in this country. I think as with any new form of technology, you might see things start to shift, right? So, for instance, if you look at on-chain lending, protocols like Aave, for instance, these have grown significantly, even just over the past year. And over time, I think what you might see is that banks stop being the default lending source for all credit, and they just become one source among many consumer options, right? So the real change won't be credit disappearing necessarily. It'll be credit that's funded and priced in a way that's more direct, and with returns flowing more to those who actually supply the capital. That's what a technology like blockchain potentially enables. So I think, regardless of where this bill lands on this particular stablecoin yield issue, it's not going to reverse that broader paradigm shift that we're seeing.
Well, I want to shift topics a little bit. We've been talking a lot about the market structure bill, because obviously that could change the entire direction of this industry. But I do want to talk to you a little bit about a very significant development this past week that I think you would be you'd be a very good person to comment on, which is NYSE's announcement of its development of a platform for trading and on-chain settlement of tokenized securities. And they also talked about, I think, their strategy to have 24/7 trading, potential integration of tokenized collateral. As someone who's a former SEC senior attorney and very focused on tokenization, and your discussion of it a moment ago, what's your reaction to that development, and what do you think it means for the industry more generally?
Yeah, I think and write about on-chain capital markets quite a bit. And I think that the key thing to keep in mind here, as you're seeing some of these legacy intermediaries start to dive in and experiment with different aspects of tokenization and blockchain, the big thing to keep in mind here is that on-chain capital markets only make sense, right, if you actually are eliminating some of the intermediaries that have historically existed. And so, if the same sort of structure exists, you're just integrating aspects of the blockchain. I don't really see what the value add is there. I do think what the New York Stock Exchange is doing is interesting because it does seem like they are pursuing something more like native issuance on the blockchain, native trading on the blockchain, right? Which I do think unlocks a lot of the benefits of on-chain capital markets, as opposed to what it looks like the DTCC, by contrast, is doing, which is preserving a lot of the intermediary structure with clearing and settlement, as opposed to trying to realize the benefits of trading on the blockchain directly, which essentially allows you to transact in on-chain capital markets without having to have a separate intermediary to take care of clearing and settlement, right? Because that happens automatically on the blockchain. And so, I think it's interesting that the incumbents and the legacy intermediaries are getting involved. I can see why they are doing that, and I think it's smart of them, and I give them credit for it. What I don't want to see is us just recreating the same highly intermediated, highly rent-seeking structure that already exists in the traditional securities markets, just with some blockchain mixed in, if that makes sense.
I asked this question a lot, and since you went there, I mean, is there a threat that happens? Like, it seems like there is. This ecosystem started to try and solve a lot of the issues that a lot of these folks who are now playing in crypto created, and now they're here. And so how do we find that kind of balance? Do you think about that?
Yeah, I think this is actually exactly where the laws and the regulations and the regulators are going to be key. What I'm hoping to see happen is the regulators and Congress, right, in this market structure bill, I want them to give the regulators enough flexibility to allow for on-chain capital market experimentation, of course, in a way that has sufficient guardrails, right, so that we're protecting consumers and preserving market integrity and all of that. But what I would love to see is for that sort of competition, right, where you have traditional securities markets, and then you have options for investors to potentially engage with on-chain capital markets, and not just investors, but potentially issuers, right? If you have public companies looking to go public that want to natively issue their stock, their securities on the blockchain, we should allow for that sort of experimentation and then let the consumers decide, let the issuers, the investors, the market decide which system is more efficient, which system is potentially better for investor fairness and market integrity. So I see that, I see it playing out that way, where we might have a period where you have traditional securities markets, right, and on-chain capital markets, potentially some hybrid, right, like where the players like the New York Stock Exchange and the DTC and NASDAQ experimenting with some hybrid version of that, and allow the market to decide which system is better and which succeeds. So I think that's where getting the regulations right and preserving that sort of flexibility for the SEC is really important.
So I want to slightly change gears here and ask you a little bit about the role of the states. All right. So, and that, which will be very important if we don't achieve legislation here, but I'm interested, which would create some preemption. I'm interested in what your thoughts are regarding the role of the states in regulating this space. I mean, obviously we're seeing a lot of activity in the prediction market side right now, where the states are litigating and enforcing all over the place there. But we're starting to see, of course, legislation, in more states trying to regulate digital assets. Obviously, New York's been doing that for a while, but California is coming online with that this year, Illinois the year after. I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much happening in this area in the courts, right? So New York State introduced a bill that would require a license from their state financial regulator, DFS, to operate a prediction market. But a lot of the action right now is happening in the courts, right? There are a number of states that have sued the prediction market platforms like Kalshi, like Polymarket, claiming that they illegally offer sports betting disguised as federally regulated event contracts, which they argue violates state gambling laws. The prediction markets claim federal preemption, like you said, saying that they're regulated by the CFTC and that trumps any state laws. And then you also have the tribal lawsuits, right? So the tribes arguing that that these prediction markets are offering illegal sports betting in violation of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which is another federal law, as well as tribal sovereignty. So these are powerful interests that the prediction markets are going up against. So the way these lawsuits have been playing out is that different states are actually starting to rule in different ways, which, Renato, as you probably know, that is the best way to set up a circuit split, which is the best predictor, no pun intended, of whether the Supreme Court will eventually take up an issue, right? So I think this is going to come to a head eventually, and you could see the Supreme Court weighing in on this issue.
All right, we got to go. So this is the last question. And I want to come back to New York Stock Exchange, DTCC, these traditional institutions coming into the space. If market structure doesn't pass, what happens to these traditional institutions who have these highly sophisticated strategies to enter the space? Do you think they continue full steam ahead, or does that momentum kind of pause?
I don't think so. The train has left the station. Like I said, I think that the broader trend is new financial infrastructure like blockchain is enabling consumers to have more control over their money, the way that they transact with their money, how they earn on their money, and how much the value of that they capture versus intermediaries. That trend is not going to be reversed. It's actually a major paradigm shift that's happening right now, and the incumbents see it too, right? So, market structure has been in the works for a long time now. I mean, even from my perch, I work at a company that's building DeFi infrastructure. We talk to traditional financial institutions every day. They are not waiting around. They see the paradigm shift happening and they want to be a part of it. So no, I don't think market structure is going to halt the momentum. I do think, though, that it is necessary to have clear rules of the road if we want the industry to flourish, if we want to protect innovation, developers, builders, entrepreneurs, and just as importantly, consumers.
Thanks so much for joining the show. As always, it was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
That was Veda Labs General Counsel TuongVy Lee.